This is the Living Vertizontal podcast, brought to you by The Church at Riverstone, a fellowship of the Church of the Nazarene in Madera, California. We are a podcast that discusses the intersection of Scripture and our lives. Together, we continue the conversation that was started each preceding Sunday morning in our worship gathering.
Hi, everybody. I'm Nick.
And I'm Natasha.
And we are the Living Vertizontal podcast with you this week as we continue our journey through the Gospel of Luke together. As a quick reminder, in our passage last week, we were working through Luke 14, or continuing our work through Luke 14, looking at verses 15 through 24. And in this passage, we were still finding ourselves at the prominent Pharisee's house for that Sabbath meal that he was at with them. And in that passage, though, we dropped in on another one of Jesus's parables. In this passage, we talked about our misplaced priorities in life, from possessions to time and productivity, and even our relationships and our social statuses or pursuits, and how we are often tempted to allow these things to distract us from responding to the invitation to participate in God's kingdom now. In today's passage, we are going to continue in Luke chapter 14, but we're going to pick up in verses 25 through 35. Like I said, we've kind of been at a Sabbath conversation or different Sabbath situations for the last 3 episodes now. So 3 weeks ago, it was in the synagogue with a synagogue leader in this interaction, and then a woman who needed healing. And then over the last 2 weeks, it's been with a leading Pharisee in that Pharisee's home for a Sabbath day meal. And there's been a lot of stuff that has been taking place at these, one of which is really Jesus has kind of created, I don't know that I want to say Jesus has created, but as a result of what Jesus has done, which is healing these people and or bringing up this parable, a spectacle has ensued. There are people who are curious about what's going on. I mean, in the synagogue, he called out the synagogue leaders for what they were unwilling to do. Like they are willing to untie their donkeys, but they're not willing to untie this woman. Like, what? That's crazy. And then he does something very similar at the Pharisee's house with the Sabbath meal, where he identifies like they're willing to help out their son or their animals, but they're unwilling to help out this man who needs help. Like he just continues to identify the brokenness and the disconnect in their religious traditions and rules and regulations with the relationship that this kingdom that he is bringing in requires and asks of each of us. And so we're moving now into a conversation where we will see in the first verse that large crowds are with him. It's no wonder that large crowds are with him. They are gathering, they would be gathering. People are gathering to see miracles, right? There are people being healed over these last 3 weeks, but they're also gathering to see like what's the next thing Jesus is going to say. People are being called out, leaders, right? Societal leaders. The synagogue leader, the Pharisee, they're being called out in the way they do things. And so I'd imagine this crowd is gathering, and maybe some of them are really like, okay, man, I want Jesus. But there's probably a lot of them who are like, I want to see this next thing that Jesus is going to do. And so that's kind of the situation that we find ourselves in as we get to our passage today for our episode, which is crowds are gathering. So Natasha, can you go ahead and read for us Luke chapter 14, verses 25 through 35?
Yes. Luke chapter 14, verse 25. Large crowds were now traveling with Jesus, and he turned and said to them, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. And whoever does not carry his cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. Which of you, wishing to build a tower, does not first sit down and count the cost to see if he has the resources to complete it? Otherwise, if he lays the foundation and is unable to finish the work, everyone who sees it will ridicule him, saying, 'This man could not finish what he started to build.' Or what king, on his way to war with another king, will not first sit down and consider whether he can engage with 10,000 men the one coming against him with 20,000? And if he is unable, he will send a delegation while the other king is still far off to ask for terms of peace. In the same way, any one of you who does not give up everything he has cannot be my disciple. Salt is good, but if the salt loses its savor, with what will it be seasoned? It is fit neither for the soil nor for the manure pile, and it is thrown out. He who has ears to hear, let him hear.
All right. Thank you for reading that for us today, Natasha. So let's just jump right in. There's probably a number of different ways we can go, but there seems to be maybe a natural progression that we can work through with respect to this passage. And the first one being essentially this statement. So the entire passage is Jesus addressing the crowd, right? Let's just call that out up top. Jesus turns to the crowd. He's been addressing all of the leaders to this point, and now it's time for everybody else to be addressed. So with that, as he turns to them, one of the first things that he says is this crazy statement about love and hate. So what are we seeing when we look at that? What are things that maybe we would need to know to understand what Jesus is saying here?
Well, yeah, from a modern culture perspective, this seems absurd. What does following Jesus have to do with hating my father, mother, wife, children, brothers, sisters? In fact, that kind of seems counter to following Jesus,
exactly.
right? So my kids would argue, wait a minute, I thought Jesus wanted us to love our siblings. And so this passage itself, I feel like, or this verse right here is very, I don't know, I think very culturally removed from us. And so it's important for us to take a moment and understand, okay, how would the people hearing Jesus have heard them say this? Now, while this is a very difficult teaching, it doesn't necessarily fly in the face of what they would have expected God to be like. And it really all comes down to, what do we mean by this word hate, right? If anyone comes to me and does not hate, and then we get this list of people. And this word hate, when we look at it closely, is really a comparative idiom. It's not an emotional command. And so there's several other examples of this use of this word hate in scripture. So for example, Genesis 29:31, where we have this comparison. So this is going way back to the beginning, right? You have this comparison between Rachel and Leah. And so Jacob, who was enamored by Rachel, agreed to work for 7 years for her hand in marriage. And when he gets to the end of the 7 years, he's very excited. He gets married, and lo and behold, he's been deceived. He instead is given Leah in Rachel's place. Right. And he goes to Laban and he says, what have you done? Right? This is not what we agreed upon. And he said, I'm sorry, man. Listen, we don't
That's
marry.
Not how we do it.
We don't marry the second daughter before the first. So you can have Leah. And then, I'll give you Rachel, but you're going to have to work another 7 years for her afterwards. Jacob's like so angry at this point. He's like, whatever, I don't care. I love Rachel. I want Rachel. Right? So he agrees to these terms. But now you have this situation, this marriage to two women where Leah and Rachel are not seen or valued equally by Jacob. Right. Because from the very beginning, Jacob loved Rachel. And so when you read the scripture, some versions of it will say that he loved Rachel and Leah he hated, right? But the truth of the matter is, Jacob didn't really hate Leah in the way we think of hate today. Rather, Jacob loved Rachel more.
Right. There's a comparison.
Yes, he loved her so much more. And so that's where that comparative idiom comes in. And so it's not to say that that Leah's hated. It's just Rachel is preferred.
It's not like an emotional disdain. It's more like a statement of preference. Yeah.
Yes,
like you said.
preference. And so this comes up again too, like similar story. So when in Malachi, when we're talking about Jacob versus Esau, right? It's written that Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated.
Yes.
And I think we've talked about that actually on this podcast when we went through the book of Malachi. You can check that out. It's a few seasons ago, I think.
I don't remember which season it was.
So, but we talked about how God doesn't hate any of his creation, right? It's just of Esau and Jacob, Jacob was the preferred choice. Jacob was the one who God chose to work his promise through.
Right.
And so again, it's a comparative, right? It's saying with Esau and Jacob, I am preferring to work my promise out through Jacob's line.
Right.
That's it. It's not that he hated Esau in the way that we think of the word hate.
It's more like a choosing, like he chose Jacob.
Yes. And so this is one of those places where I think stuff really literally gets lost in translation.
Sure.
And so when we have this different understanding of this is a choice thing or a preference thing, or this is the direction we're going sort of understanding of this word hate, then you start to realize that, oh, so Jesus isn't asking the crowds to literally hate their family members. He's not saying hate your father, mother in that sense. He's saying, you need to choose me over your father and your mother and your wife and your children and your brothers and your sisters and your business partnerships and your wealth and now this becomes very consistent with everything we talked about in last week's passage.
Yes.
And you start to realize, okay, this makes sense because this is consistent with who God is. This is consistent with who we know Jesus to be. Jesus would never ask us to literally hate someone in the sense that our culture thinks of hating someone.
Right.
He's rather calling you to choose him over all of these relationships too, which sometimes these relationships are in alignment with God and his desire and his will. But sometimes these relationships can lead us in directions that are inconsistent with God's will. And we have to be discerning to be able to hear God's voice in those moments to know what is he truly asking of us and what is the next right thing? Because ultimately God is number one in our life.
Right.
And then these other relationships follow. One of the other cultural pieces I think to keep in mind here, and we've touched on this a little bit previously as well, is that so much of your identity is wrapped up in your family and your relationships with family, that when Jesus is asking them to choose him over their family ties and relationships, you have to understand that carries more, even more weight than us today making those choices. Sometimes this could cost them their trade, their social class, a marriage option, right? Or having like higher legal status, right? It could cost them economic security or really physical safety. And so to be cut off from your family for choosing Jesus over their wishes or wills, I mean, this would have been something that would have been not only very emotionally painful, but also economically and socially catastrophic. And so I think it's important for us to recognize that culturally, this carries a little bit more weight as well in when you're talking about the cost of following Jesus than it might for some of us today.
Right. So, you know, at the beginning when you were talking through like that love-hate conversation, we were addressing this idea that hate isn't necessarily about, you know, having this disdain or this animosity towards somebody. Well, in the same way, like this love is not necessarily to be enamored by or to like have this emotional attachment to. It really is to make the choice for, right? So make the choice for Jesus and God over all of your familial relationships, regardless of what it might be costing you. You are being invited to a new kingdom, a new king, and a new identity, right? To this point, your family has provided your identity, your security, your safety. From now on, I am your identity, your security, your safety. That's where your choice must lie. That's where your choice is going to take you when you follow after me.
Absolutely.
Which I think as we move into verse 27 and kind of look at that statement there is exactly what Jesus is getting at, where he says, and whoever does not carry his cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. I think it's important for us to identify, like, when Jesus is talking about cross here, nobody is thinking, oh, that cute little thing that I have on a chain around my neck, or even the thing that we have come to make an icon that we have in the front of our church. They are thinking
it's not beautiful.
It's not beautiful. They are thinking of essentially a weapon of mass terror.
Right.
When he says pick up your cross, there's nothing glamorous about this. There's nothing victorious about this. This is a tool of state-sanctioned terror and oppression that they are feeling and that they see in front of them almost every moment of every day, because crosses would line the road with traitors and with anybody who tried to stand against Rome or stand in opposition to what they were trying to accomplish, as a reminder to everybody else of, this is what you can expect if you're not going to step to the line that we expect you to step to.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just a method of public execution. It was a terror tactic, and it was intended to humiliate people and to send a very clear message to anyone who might try to rise up against this military power.
Right. And I mean, it was so bad. It was considered such a terrible thing to do to somebody. Roman citizens weren't even allowed to be crucified.
Right. They were protected from this.
Right.
This was reserved for really the lowest class of criminals.
Yes.
And so, yeah, anybody who had Roman citizenship, they could not be crucified.
Yeah. So now you hear this invitation to pick up your cross, and it's like, okay, so I'm not an insider, because insiders aren't allowed to even have to deal with the cross. I'm not an insider, and this is something that is just overwhelming. This is something that is terrible, terrifying. When I was dialoguing with Bible, the statement was made that Jesus is saying, quote, "Be ready to be publicly destroyed for your allegiance to me." Like, that is exactly what he is inviting them into, which is not necessarily the way you go about trying to get the crowds who are following you to be like, yeah, sign me up. Where's the line for me to put my signature on?
Yeah, and I mean, the tragedy of this is a lot of the crowds in hearing this, right? This is what begins like this movement of dissipation, right? When they recognize, they count the cost, right? They take the moment to count the cost or take some time to count the cost. And many decide that this is not something that's worth carrying their cross for.
Yeah, yeah. And so I think that takes us perfectly, kind of segues us into the next ideas that we're going to encounter in this passage, in this communication that Jesus is having with the crowds, where he does say, you know, you got to count the cost. Which of you wishing to build a tower does not first sit down and count the cost to see if he has the resources to complete it? And so there's that one. And then the other one is, or what king on his way to war with another king will not first sit down and consider whether he can engage with 10,000 men, the one coming against him with 20,000. And, you know, interestingly, also when I was dialoguing with Bible, trying to understand these examples more, like why would Jesus use these specific examples? It actually brought up the idea that while Jesus is making these general statements, there is the potential that there was some pretty explicit things that he was saying that the hearers would have understood. Like he identifies this person who builds towers and maybe does or does not count the cost, and identifies this person who goes to war and either does or doesn't identify the cost and count the cost. And so specifically, the two examples that were brought up as I was looking into it were, one, Pontius Pilate was actually pretty famous for mismanagement of funds, but also like conducting these building projects. If you remember, it was probably like 4 or 5 weeks ago, we talked about the Tower of Siloam and that fell on those 18 people. That was one of those building projects that Pilate initiated around the area. And there was many of them that he was doing, and he regularly mismanaged the funds in association with these building projects. And there were building projects that did not get completed. And so it was like this unsaid or unwritten, though everybody understood it, idea that, man, how foolish is Pilate? He is regularly doing these things. He has this overinflated ego where it's like, I'm going to leave these monuments of my greatness, but he's not even able to complete them. How embarrassing is that? And then in the same way, as I looked into, okay, so what might be like a real world connection that these people are making to the war conversation, it brought up this idea that most likely he could be making a jab at Herod Antipas. Herod had recently picked a fight with a neighboring king named Aretas because of a messy divorce and a scandalous remarriage that took place. but he didn't count the cost. So he went after this guy in passion, and he didn't count the cost. And as a result, he got crushed. And it was a massive public embarrassment for him to have kind of instigated that, but then not even been able to follow through on what he was trying to accomplish. And so with these things in mind, like this is what the people probably are coming to mind with as they hear him say this. Jesus is making this statement: you must count the cost, because look what happens when you don't count the cost.
Yeah, and I think it's really important for us to recognize, when we bring this out of the parable and into kind of our real world practice, that we recognize that when we fail to count the cost, our lives, you mentioned, that they had left these monuments erected, right? As
half erected.
Half of his greatness, right? And that's what we serve as, right? When we are Christians and we fail, quote unquote Christians, and we fail to count the cost, and then life gets hard, our lives stand as monuments testifying to God's good, but he's not that good, or he's not that big, or he's not that powerful, or not that dependable. And so I think this really needs to be a strong caution, recognizing that this isn't just a caution for the individual, but this has implications that move far beyond the individual. It affects the community, it affects the kingdom as a whole, and it can be absolutely devastating to have this be a testament to the God that we serve, because that is not a true picture of who God is at all.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I can only imagine, you have these half-built structures throughout the city. Anytime somebody walks by that, they're looking at it going, are you kidding me? How pathetic.
I think about the California high-speed rail is a good
100%.
example. Like, we've spent so much money, right? We as voters, we voted on this,
it was a long
15 years
time
ago,
ago.
something like that. It got passed. So we start building this thing. And now there are aspects of it all over the
There's
place.
just random
right?
structures throughout the valley.
But it's still, we still have nothing really to show for it. And so it's a constant reminder of this to this point, right? A failed effort.
Right. Yeah. A halfway commitment.
Yep.
And a waste, really. And so as you were talking about, with our own lives, when we bring it into that conversation, are we going to be that half-built embarrassment, or are we going to be that fully erected monument that is a good representation of the kingdom that we claim to belong to? It really comes down to that. And I think as we look at society as a whole, I think we can recognize that the reason why we are in the state that we are in, the reason why we can look around and see so many people who are turned off by the church or who are leaving the church, it's because of things like this. It's because people who are claiming to be fully invested in this kingdom, when it really comes down to it, and like you said, stuff gets hard in life, their lives demonstrate God is good, but he's not that good. And so you have a world who is watching these people, watching these monuments begin to be erected, and instead of them ever seeing those things come to completion, they see them get abandoned. And people are like, man, if they're abandoning it halfway through, why would I even spend a cent? It is so vital for us as Christians to genuinely be counting the cost even on a daily basis, even after we've made that first decision that we made to say, you know what, I'm going to follow Jesus. We daily need to be counting that cost. We daily need to be picking up our cross so we can continue in that construction process, because there is a serious cost, a steep cost to abandoning the project that we have given ourselves to. And it gets played out in society on a daily basis.
Yeah, when you think about each of these examples you shared and the implications for the rulers who oversaw them in this first century Jewish culture, I mean, it really was publicly humiliating for those leaders. It undermine their authority and influence. And as Christians, that's the absolute last thing we want to do to our witness.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think that that's then why Jesus goes in verse 33 and makes the statement, in the same way, any one of you who does not give up everything he has cannot be my disciple. And, I initially, I guess when you read that, it does sound pretty all inclusive. It sounds like you got to give up everything. But I also feel like there's like a slight minimization in my own mind, or maybe like, okay, yeah, sure, give up everything. And then I kind of move on to the next conversation, maybe because the next conversation about salt seems more like an appendage, but we'll get there in a second. As I looked into this verse 33 and this invitation to give up everything, I found some really fascinating things that put a lot more weight here for me. And that was this idea that in the Greek language, the phrase that is used for give up everything is the same one that would be used, for example, when an individual in this time is choosing to leave their family and bid them farewell. When they are leaving, they are moving somewhere else, they are starting a new venture. Genuinely, I think of like Abram in the Old Testament, when God calls him to go and he bids farewell to his family and leaves, he is leaving all of that behind. He is now given up everything. He's given up his security. He's given up his family identity. He's given up his future. He's given up his wealth. He's given up his inheritance. He's given it all up. He's given it up. And he has bid farewell to them and he has walked away. That is exactly what Jesus is saying we have to do. And in telling these crowds that are traveling with him, this is what he is saying. If you want to follow me, if you want to be my disciple, you have to bid farewell to everything.
It kind of bookends where he started, right?
Yes.
When he started talking about how you have to choose me over your family.
Right.
And so it's appropriate. I feel like that now
Yes,
here
it's
he
like a full
goes
circle.
right back to that
Yes.
and reminds them you're going to have to bid everything you know
Yes.
farewell. And you're stepping into this new identity as a member of a new household,
Right.
a new kingdom, right? A new culture. And I will show you how to live that out.
And as I think about it, Abram or Abraham, we read in the New Testament, this decision to follow God, to bid farewell to his family and walk after God into this unknown, was credited to him as righteousness.
Mm-hmm.
Not all like the perfect life that he lived after that. Because if we go back into the story of his life was not perfect after that. There was a lot of loops and missteps along the way.
Mm-hmm.
And yet it was this decision to bid farewell and fully step into God as his king, God as Lord in his life, that was credited to him as righteousness. And I hear that and I think about that in this passage. And then I also think about who we are as Nazarenes and who we are called to be, holy as he is holy, and to live as he lived. All of a sudden, something that sounds unattainable becomes a little bit more accessible. Not easy, but it becomes more accessible because I recognize that the life of righteousness, or to put it in Nazarene terms, the life of holiness, or an entirely sanctified life, is not necessarily the life that is void of missteps or loops along the way. It is a life that has bid farewell to all that they used to hold on to. And so I think we need to really hear that and key in on that. Like it is a misrepresentation to say that in bidding farewell, I'm going to be perfect going forward. At the same time, we need to make sure that we understand the full depth of what's being said when we say we're bidding farewell to those things.
Right. I mean, Abraham continues throughout his life to bid farewell to things
Yes.
over and over.
Right.
I mean, it would have been so easy when Abraham and Lot came to the place of splitting ways for Abraham to take the choices of the land. After all, he seems to be the one that the story is following.
The more major
right.
person.
So he should have some influence there, but yet he doesn't. And he allows Lot to choose in that moment. And he he continues to trust God. He continues to give up his
Right.
own way to follow God. When he's given a son, right? He's asked to sacrifice this son.
And he bids
and
farewell.
again, he bids farewell to his own way. And that's this continual working out of our salvation. When we talk about that, when we talk about living a life of holiness, it's that continual choice, that continual resolve
Right.
to bid farewell to everything we once held dear. And I feel like there are moments, right, with Sarah and with Sarah as maidservant, where we see clearly in his life where he took things into his
He picked
own.
him back up.
Yeah, he doubted God, and there are those moments, but yet he always went back to, and he continued in his resolve, and he pressed on. And I think that God was with him through all of that, and continued to patiently walk with him in this decision he'd made to bid all things farewell.
Yeah. And so, I mean, maybe even here as we're hearing this, maybe you're hearing this and you're going, well, you're sitting in like this cycle of discouragement or defeat because you're like, man, I've had a lot of missteps lately, and that's just what defines me. The truth is, the missteps don't have to define us, because we are continued to be invited to bid farewell, right? We talked last week about the power of now and how the invitation is now. And yes, there could be a past behind us where we didn't choose now, but even now we have that opportunity. And that's the hope even that we find now. In the midst of our defeat, in the midst of our downward spiral, we can bid farewell. Jesus is inviting us to bid farewell. And we can walk into his kingdom, and that is credited to us as righteousness as we bid farewell to those things that we so often find ourselves clinging to. Okay, so now we're going to move into verse 34, and I know I made the statement that I feel like the salt is a bit of an appendage, and again, maybe I'm way off on that, but genuinely, as I read like from 25 to 35, I am fully vibing and tracking from 25 to 33. But then as soon as I get to 34, it almost seems like there's this really hard shift, or this like random thing that Jesus brings into the picture where he says, salt is good, but if the salt loses its savor, with what will be seasoned? It is neither fit for the soil nor the manure pile, and it's thrown out. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. So believing that Jesus is intentional with what he's doing, and that Luke is intentional with how he's reporting things, let's try to salvage this from my accusation of being an appendage, because I guarantee you it's not. How does this kind of work together with what is being said and what Jesus is communicating to the crowds?
Well, I go back to that monument conversation that we've been having, where, when these rulers set out to erect monuments in their honor, or to build this major aqueduct system, and they're attempting to achieve that. And it has this aqueduct system has a purpose, right? First, it's a functional purpose, but then also this, look, great as me,
Let's
right?
Celebrate him. Yeah.
Right. And so, salt likewise has a purpose.
Yes.
And so, again, if the salt loses its saltiness, then it's what's its purpose? Its purpose is gone. It's waste.
It's worthless.
It's worthless. And the same for a monument that isn't achieving its end, right? A half built monument, a half baked military plan, right? It had good intention.
Well, it had an intention, but it's not meeting its intention.
Right. So, but it failed. And so, at this point it's waste.
Yeah.
And so I think this tacked on to here, as you said, I think it really it echoes this heart of the importance of things serving or leaning into or living into their purpose.
Yep. Yeah. On Sunday, we spent a decent amount of time talking about the salt, because I did bring it up at our table. Somebody else was facilitating, so I kind of just got to be a participant. And I threw out there that it was weird. I feel like this is kind of just tacked on there. It's an appendage. And so we spent a lot of time talking about it as a result of that accusation that I levied. And through the conversation, we had it went really good. It was pretty awesome. And I feel like I walked away with a lot of good understanding about salt that I had no idea. So we started looking into salt. We started looking into the salt specifically that these people would have been exposed to, that they would have been using, what they would have been using it for. And so salt served a lot of different purposes. It would help flavor meals. It would help preserve meals. It would be used in like medical treatments to help treat things. It could be used in payment for like a soldier's wages. It could be used in agriculture for both fertilizing, but also for cooking when they're baking things in an oven to for helping make it even hotter. And the interesting thing is, so those are all the different purposes that salt served during this time, right? So they're hearing, what good is it for? I read it. I read salt and I go, yeah, if it's not actually salty, it doesn't do anything for my steak, so it's gross, right? But there's a lot more that they're recognizing, a lot more purpose that salt has. And if it doesn't, it's not actually able to accomplish its intended purpose in each of those avenues, it's worthless to them. And interestingly, the salt that they would be exposed to would be salt from like the Dead Sea. And it's not pure sodium chloride. It's going to be sodium chloride mixed with a bunch of other stuff as well. Now, the interesting thing is the bunch of other stuff, if the sodium chloride was taken away from it, was removed from it, that bunch of other stuff would still be this white powdery substance.
So you're talking about like other minerals.
Other minerals that cannot accomplish what sodium chloride can, right? And so essentially, if the saltiness of that stuff was taken away, it would still look like salt. And Jesus is talking about this idea that if salt loses its purpose, like you said, it's good for nothing, we need to throw it out. Interestingly, they're going to be hearing this and going, well, it doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't look like salt anymore. It just doesn't serve the purpose that salt serves. And so it should be thrown away. And when we kind of sunk our teeth into that and began to think about that for ourselves, it was a pretty strong indictment in a sense, where how often do we maybe look like salt, but the truth is we're not actually serving the purpose that we were intended to serve? Let me ask it another way, so I'm not using the word salt anymore, which I think is the direction that Jesus was going. How often do we look like disciples while not actually serving the purpose that we were intended to serve? I think about this specific situation that Jesus is in. He has got crowds following after him, but now he's saying, this is what it looks like to actually follow me. There is a difference between the proximity conversation, being around me and wanting to see the things that I'm doing, and actually being with me. There's a difference. We had that conversation a couple weeks ago, and I think Jesus is continuing that conversation even here, even now. And I think that tags in pretty consistently with the conversation that we were having when we were talking about like the towers being constructed or the war, going out to war without counting the cost, and the cost that's subsequently incurred when we do leave things incomplete as Christians. When we say our God is good, but he's not that good, and the cost that can result. In the same way, I think we're still having that same conversation. And I do feel like the warning is so clear here, right? We can do all kinds of things to make it look like we are Christians, like we are following after Jesus. We can fool a lot of people, but at some point when we are going to be used in a way, right? Like when the salt is being used, at some point when we are going to be used, we are going to be found out for being an imposter, for being something that looked like salt, but wasn't actually capable of serving that purpose, for being something that looked like a disciple or a follower of Jesus, but then when it came down to it, we're not actually capable of serving that purpose.
Well, and when you think about it in that context, and we talked earlier about some of the functions of it. If you think about it for preserving meat, for example, and you use what you think is salt to preserve this meat, now not only is the salt a waste, but you've also now destroyed the meat around it. And I think this is important to remember, that the consequences go well beyond just us.
Yes.
It has far-reaching consequences. And so again, count the cost, because the impacts are bigger than just you.
Yeah. And let's be honest with ourselves, right? Like me be honest with myself, not necessarily me be honest with you, Natasha. I'm going to call you out on how you're not being true salt right now. You just look like salt. No, I need to be honest with myself. In what areas of my life do I have the appearance of salt? But when I really look deeper, there's no sodium chloride present. In what areas of my life have I began to construct a monument, and then I realize I know that as of right now, there are insufficient funds to complete what I have started? We need to be honest with ourselves. And the solution, the really cool thing is, this sounds super hopeless. This sounds super like down in the dumps. And, in a way, sure.
It's a warning. The whole passage is a warning. Yeah.
And it's okay for us to hear warnings and be like, oh, shoot. But it doesn't just leave us with this warning, right? Because the invitation is to bid farewell to all of that stuff that essentially incapacitates us or makes us not be able to fulfill the purpose that we were called to fulfill. The solution is to bid farewell. The warning is, don't do these things. The invitation is, so bid farewell. Follow me. And then you don't have to worry about that incomplete tower. You don't have to worry about a war that you'll never be able to win. You don't have to worry about being a white powdery substance that has the appearance of salt but isn't actually salt. You're going to be all these things. I will make you into a monument worth seeing. I will make you into a victorious battle. I will make you into that purposeful salt that can actually accomplish great things. As you bid farewell to your own pursuits, as you bid farewell to you trying to be in control and clinging for control in life, as you bid farewell to those things and cling tightly to me and remain rooted in me, I will do these things in you. And so maybe this week we hear this warning and we allow the warning to invite us into a time of reflection with him. And then we hear his invitation, right? So, Jesus, where is it that I'm leaving things half built, that I am suffering in defeat, where I am acting like something that I'm not? What are the areas in my life where I am not fully living into the purpose that I should be as a disciple of you? And then as we find those things, as Jesus helps us identify those places in our life, let's bid farewell to them. Let's say goodbye.
As you journey with us through the Gospel of Luke, we recommend purchasing Midweek Meditations, A Journey Through Luke, Part 5, which is available for purchase on Amazon. Also, be sure to follow the Living Vertizontal podcast to stay current on all our new releases. To learn more about the Church at Riverstone, visit us at thechurchatriverstone.org.